James Carter stood in the middle of the company lobby, still gripping his mop, when Victoria Hayes's voice came down cold and final. "You're fired." Every eye in the room turned toward him, flat, dismissive, and certain. No one knew he had spent the entire night alone, quietly saving the building's electrical system. He turned to leave. Then a small girl pushed through the crowd, wrapped her arms around his waist, and began to cry. "Please don't go. You remind me of my real daddy." James Carter was 33 years old, and he had grown used to being invisible. He arrived at Hayes Corporation every morning before 6, let himself in through the service entrance, and began his rounds without announcement. The lobby gleamed under his care. The hallways were spotless. The break rooms were emptied and wiped down before most of the staff had even found their parking spots. To the people who passed him in the corridors, James was simply part of the building, as unremarkable as the light switches and as easy to overlook as the floor beneath their feet. He was tall and lean, with a face that gave very little away. His dark eyes carried a permanent tiredness that had nothing to do with a lack of sleep, and everything to do with the particular weight of a life spent solving problems alone. He moved quietly and efficiently, the way a man moves when he has learned that drawing attention rarely leads anywhere good. What no one at Hayes Corporation knew, what no one had bothered to ask, was that James Carter had spent 4 years studying electrical and systems engineering before life pulled the plans out from under him. He had been 1 semester from graduating when his wife left, when the diagnosis came, when the world he had built in his mind folded neatly and disappeared. He had not gone back to finish. There had been no time, and then no reason, and eventually the window had simply closed. Now he had Ava. She was 6 years old, small for her age, with his same dark eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw. She had been born with a congenital heart condition that required ongoing monitoring and, at intervals, procedures that cost more money than James made in 3 months. He had structured his entire existence around her schedule, her doctor's appointments, her medication times, the specific brand of applesauce she would actually eat without complaint. Every financial decision he made passed through the single filter of what she needed. The janitor position at Hayes Corporation paid steadily and offered health coverage that, while not generous, kept Ava's treatment accessible. That was the only math that mattered. He had applied without ceremony and been hired the same afternoon. Hayes Corporation occupied a 22-story tower in the financial district and operated as a mid-sized investment and consulting firm with ambitions significantly larger than its current footprint. Victoria Hayes had inherited the company from her father 7 years earlier and had spent every one of those years trimming what was inefficient and expanding what was not. She was 32, precise, and widely described by her staff as brilliant in the same careful tone people use when they mean to say difficult. The company was weeks away from closing the largest contract in its history, a partnership with a national infrastructure group worth several $100 million. Every department was under pressure. Errors were not tolerated. James was aware of none of this. He was focused on the service elevator, which had been making a sound it should not make, and he was calculating whether he could fix it before anyone noticed. The failure announced itself at 11:47 on a Wednesday night. James had already put in his standard shift and was pulling on his coat in the basement locker room when the building's primary electrical panel threw an alarm that hummed through the walls like a low chord. He stood still for a moment, listening. Then he walked to the utility corridor where the main distribution board was mounted and pulled the access panel open. What he saw was not a simple problem. The fault was buried 3 layers deep in the load management system. A cascading error in the secondary relay network that had been accumulating for weeks, invisible to the routine diagnostics that the building's contracted engineering firm ran each month. Left unaddressed, it would trip the primary breaker sometime in the next several hours. When it did, the building would lose power. The servers on the 14th floor, the ones that held the financial modeling data for the infrastructure contract, would go offline. Some of that data was backed up. Not all of it. James considered his options for approximately 45 seconds. The contracted engineers were off-site. The building manager was unreachable. Calling the emergency line would trigger a protocol that would take hours to route and would almost certainly result in a controlled shutdown regardless. By the time anyone with credentials arrived and assessed the situation, the damage might already be done. He went back to his locker and retrieved the small set of tools he always carried, not because his job required them, but because the building had a habit of presenting problems and he had a habit of solving them. He returned to the panel. He worked through the night. It was not straightforward work. The relay configuration was non-standard. modified at some point in the building's history by someone who had known what they were doing but had not documented it clearly. James had to trace each connection by hand, rebuild his understanding of the system from the physical evidence alone, and then isolate the fault without disrupting the parallel circuits that were still running correctly. He worked without rushing and without stopping, the way he had learned to work on everything in his life. At 4:17 in the morning, the alarm stopped. He rechecked every connection, confirmed the load distribution was stable, replaced the access panel, and cleaned the area until it looked as though no one had been there. He left the building through the service entrance the same way he had arrived. He told no one. This was the first mistake, not the fixing, but the silence. Hayes Corporation had protocols. Any work performed on the primary electrical system required documentation, authorization, and a report filed within 24 hours. James had performed that work without reporting it, without authorization, and without leaving any trace. He had not thought about the rules. He had thought about the servers. By morning, the building was running perfectly, and no one knew why. The accusation arrived the following afternoon in the form of a 3-paragraph email. Marcus Webb was a senior systems engineer at the firm, contracted to maintain Hayes Corporation's infrastructure. He had arrived that morning to run a scheduled check, found anomalies in the relay logs, and drawn a conclusion that was technically defensible and completely wrong. His email, addressed to the building manager and copied to Victoria Hayes's executive assistant, stated that an unauthorized individual had accessed and modified the primary electrical system overnight. The description of the access point matched the service corridor. The time window matched James's shift. Marcus had not asked anyone what had happened. He had looked at the data and written what the data appeared to say. By 3 o'clock, Victoria Hayes had read the email twice. She was not a person who tolerated ambiguity, particularly not in the weeks leading up to a contract negotiation of this magnitude. The infrastructure group's due diligence team was scheduled to tour the building in 10 days. Any suggestion of unauthorized system access, any hint that the building's operations were not tightly controlled, could unravel months of preparation. She called her building manager, then Marcus Webb, then her head of operations. By the time she finished those calls, she had made a decision. The staff knew something was happening before anything was formally announced. Word moved through open offices and shared lunch tables the way it always does in fragments and whispers and knowing looks. The consensus that formed was not charitable. The janitor messed with the electrical system? One of the junior analysts said, loud enough for 3 cubicles to hear. Why would he even go near that? Probably wanted attention, someone else offered. Or thought he was being helpful. There's a reason they hire engineers for that, the first voice replied. No one considered that James might have known what he was doing. The idea did not occur to them. People see what the context tells them to see. And the context here was a man in a maintenance uniform who had touched something he had no business touching. James heard the whispers before the end of the day. He understood what was being said. He had a choice at that point. He could explain himself, produce the evidence of what he had actually done, force a conversation that would require people to update their assumptions. He had done exactly that twice before in his life, and both times the explanation had cost him more than the silence would have. He chose silence again. He finished his shift, clocked out, drove to the school where Ava was waiting in the aftercare room, and listened to her describe a disagreement she had with another child over the proper way to build a tower with foam blocks. He made dinner. He helped her with her reading. He did not think about work until he was lying in the dark, and then he thought about it only briefly before letting it go. He could not afford to lose this job. The meeting was called for 8 o'clock the next morning. It was not a private meeting. Victoria Hayes held it in the main lobby, a space large enough to hold the entire ground floor staff, and open enough that word would carry to every floor within the hour. This was not accidental. She believed in clear signals, and a clear signal required witnesses. James arrived at 6:45, as he always did, and was intercepted at the service entrance by the building manager, who told him to report to the lobby and not to begin his rounds. He nodded and changed his route. By 8, the lobby held approximately 60 people. Most of them already knew the broad outline of what had happened. They stood in clusters, arms folded or phones in hand, watching the elevator bank for Victoria Hayes. She arrived at exactly 8 o'clock in a dark charcoal suit, her expression already set. She walked to the center of the room without hurry, and the conversation stopped as she passed through them. James stood near the edge of the group, apart from no one in particular and belonging to no cluster. His hands were at his sides. His face was the same as it always was still, and a little tired. Victoria did not look at him immediately. She addressed the room first. Every person in this building operates under a set of rules that exist to protect the company and protect each other, she said. Her voice was measured and clear. Those rules are not suggestions. When someone decides, on their own, that the rules don't apply to them, they put everything at risk. That is not something I am willing to accept. Then she looked at James. Your employment with Hayes Corporation is terminated, effective immediately. Please surrender your access card to building management. The silence that followed was the kind that presses down. James held her gaze for 2 seconds, not in defiance, not in appeal, simply in the manner of someone who has decided to experience what is happening without trying to alter it. Then he reached into his shirt pocket, removed his access card, and held it out toward the building manager. He did not speak. He did not ask for an opportunity to explain. He did not look to the people around him for support, because he already knew it would not be there. There was a small sound from one of the junior staff, not quite a laugh, not quite satisfaction, something in between. James did not react to it. He thought about Ava. He thought about her next appointment, scheduled for the following Thursday. He thought about the insurance cards in his wallet, which would be worthless in 30 days. He did not let any of this reach his face. He turned toward the exit. He had taken 4 steps when he heard the sound. It came from the direction of the corridor that connected the lobby to the executive suite on the ground floor, a door swinging open, small footsteps moving fast, urgent in the way that only a child's footsteps are urgent, when the body is running ahead of any plan. Chloe Hayes was 6 years old, slight and serious-faced, with her mother's dark hair pulled into a braid that had mostly escaped its tie. She had been waiting in the executive suite's small sitting room, as she did on mornings when her nanny was unavailable and the school day started late. She had been reading a picture book, then she had heard her mother's voice, and then she had heard the silence that followed, and then she had gotten up. She moved through the crowd, the way children do directly, without apology, as though the adults around her were simply furniture placed inconveniently between where she was and where she meant to be. People stepped aside without quite knowing why. When she reached James, she wrapped both arms around his waist and pressed her face against his side and began to cry. The lobby did not go quiet so much as it ceased to function. Conversations that had been resuming in undertones stopped. People who had been checking their phones looked up. Victoria Hayes, who had turned to speak with her head of operations, turned back. Chloe's voice was muffled against James's jacket, but audible. Please don't go. You're just like my real daddy. James did not move for a moment. Then, carefully, he placed one hand on the back of her head, a brief, steady pressure, the way you'd comfort someone you know, and crouched down until he was at her level. He said something to her quietly, too low for anyone else to hear. Whatever it was, it made her loosen her grip slightly, though she did not let go. Victoria Hayes stood 12 feet away and felt something she had not expected to feel in a company lobby at 8 in the morning. She had looked at James Carter and seen a liability, a rule breaker, a maintenance worker who had overstepped and needed to be removed before the consequences of his overstepping became her problem. She had built a complete picture of him in her mind, and that picture had been sufficient, and she had acted on it. The picture she was looking at now did not match the one she had constructed. She did not speak. She did not move. She watched her daughter hold on to a man she had just fired, and she did not know what to do with that. The day did not proceed as planned. Victoria told her assistant to reschedule the 9 o'clock briefing and spent the following hour in her office, doing something she almost never did, questioning a decision she had already made. The building manager, a practical man named Frank Dolan, knocked on her door at 9:45. He had a look on his face that she had come to associate with information that was going to complicate things. Chloe and the janitor, he said, taking the chair she gestured toward. I can tell you what I know, if it's useful. It had started, he explained, about 3 months earlier. Chloe had been in the lobby after school, waiting for her mother, when one of the wheels had broken off the small rolling case she used to carry her art supplies. She had been near tears over it, because the case had been a gift, and she was old enough to understand that some things, once broken, stay broken. James had been nearby. He had looked at the wheel, gone to his supply closet, come back with 2 small tools, and fixed it in about 4 minutes. He had not made a production of it. He had not talked much at all. He had just fixed it and handed it back. After that, Chloe had started saying hello to him in the mornings. James had always responded briefly, kindly, the way he responded to everyone, but he had never encouraged more than that. He was aware, Frank said, that he was in a position where being seen as having an inappropriate attachment to the CEO's daughter would be the end of his employment immediately. So he had kept a careful distance. He was always polite. He was never familiar. But when Chloe brought him a drawing she had made, he had accepted it without embarrassment. When she showed him a book she was reading, he had listened. When she told him, in the fractured way of children, that her father had left and she did not understand why, he had not tried to explain it. He had just been there. Chloe was a child who had learned, in a short and specific way, that adults could disappear without warning. She had responded to this lesson by becoming selective, careful, and watchful. She trusted very few people. The short list included her mother, one particular teacher, and, apparently, the building janitor. James had never spoken of this to anyone, Frank said. He had not mentioned it to HR, not referenced it in any conversation, had given no indication that he had any relationship with the child whatsoever. Victoria sat with this for a long moment. Why wouldn't he have said something? She asked. Frank looked at her steadily. Because he knew it wouldn't help him. Victoria called Marcus Webb back into her office that afternoon. She had been replaying the original accusation with new attention to detail. Marcus was technically proficient and professionally confident traits she generally valued, but she was beginning to notice that his certainty had not been based on anything he had personally witnessed. He had interpreted the relay logs. He had drawn a conclusion. He had not. She realized as she read his email again, done anything so basic as ask James Carter what had happened. Walk me through what the logs actually showed, she said. Marcus explained. The relay configuration had been accessed and modified. The access window corresponded with the overnight period. The changes were technically sophisticated, significantly more sophisticated, he added with a certain reluctance, than he would have expected from a random, unauthorized intrusion. More sophisticated, Victoria repeated. What do you mean? He meant, he said, that whoever had made the modifications understood the system at a level that was not obvious. The original fault that had been corrected was one that his own team had missed during their last 3 monthly checks. He had not, until now, mentioned this second point. Victoria looked at him for a moment without speaking. She authorized a full technical review of the electrical system and the relay logs. She asked her head of IT to cross-reference the server uptime records for the night in question. Then she called the building manager and asked him to pull the security footage from the utility corridor. The footage showed James Carter entering the utility corridor at 11:52 in the evening. It showed him working at the primary electrical panel for 4 hours and 21 minutes. It showed him replacing the access panel, cleaning the area, and leaving. It showed no evidence of damage. It showed a great deal of evidence of methodical, careful, skilled work. The IT cross-reference confirmed that the servers on the 14th floor had experienced a spike in instability at approximately midnight, consistent with an incipient fault in the relay network. It also confirmed that the instability had resolved by 4:30 in the morning and that no data had been lost. The technical review, completed by a different engineering firm that Victoria brought in that same afternoon, identified the original fault in the relay system, the one that had been building for weeks. They also identified that it had been corrected. The engineer who led the review told Victoria, with a degree of professional admiration she could hear in his voice, that whoever had performed the repair had prevented a full primary system failure. He added that this was not a repair that most certified engineers would have been comfortable attempting in the middle of the night, without documentation, without a second opinion, under time pressure. Victoria asked him to put that in writing. He did. She found James at home that evening. She had asked Frank for his address, and Frank had looked at her for half a second before writing it down. James lived in a ground-floor apartment in a neighborhood 2 miles from the office, a tidy place with a small front stoop where someone had left a pair of child-sized rain boots. She knocked at 6 in the evening, after Ava had been picked up from school and fed, and he opened the door and looked at her without surprise, as though he had been expecting something, though not necessarily this. She told him what the investigation had found. She told him about the engineering review and the IT records and the footage. She told him that Marcus Webb's report had been based on an incomplete reading of evidence that Marcus had not fully investigated, and that this had been identified and addressed. James listened to all of this without expression. "I owe you an explanation and an apology," Victoria said. She was not accustomed to saying those words in sequence, and she was aware that something in her voice was not quite as controlled as she would have liked. "I made a decision without adequate information. That was wrong." James was quiet for a moment. Then, "How is Chloe?" Victoria paused. Of all the responses she had prepared for, this was not one of them. "She's fine," Victoria said. "She was upset this morning. She's been asking about you." He nodded, as though this was something he had already calculated. The following morning, Victoria called a company-wide meeting in the same lobby, at the same hour, before most of the junior staff had settled into their routines. She stood in the same spot she had occupied 24 hours earlier, and she used the same clear voice. She told the assembled staff that the termination announced the previous morning had been made in error. She told them that James Carter had prevented a significant system failure that would have disrupted the company's operations at a critical time. She told them that the error in the initial report had been traced to Marcus Webb, who had drawn conclusions from incomplete evidence without due diligence, and that Marcus's contract with the firm would not be renewed. The room was very still. "It is not enough to make a decision quickly," Victoria continued. "A decision made quickly and incorrectly is worse than no decision at all. I made that error. I am correcting it now, publicly, because the damage was done publicly." She looked across the room toward James, who was standing near the same spot he had occupied the day before. "Mr. Carter, I was wrong. I am sorry." He held her gaze across the lobby, a long, quiet exchange that the people nearest them would later describe in different ways, all of which agreed that it was not a small moment. He did not say it was fine, because it had not been fine. He did not reach for formalities. He said, simply and without performance, "Thank you for doing that." It was more than enough, though Victoria did not fully understand that yet. After the meeting, she found herself doing something she rarely did, sitting with a question rather than moving immediately to its answer. James Carter had spent the night fixing a system that saved her company, and then walked away without credit, without documentation, without apparent concern for whether anyone would notice. When accused, he had not defended himself. When fired, he had not fought. He had absorbed everything and continued moving in the direction he had decided to move. She wanted to understand why. She began, carefully, to ask questions, not of James directly, not yet, but of the people around him. Frank Dolan, who had observed James for 14 months. The woman at the school Ava attended, who mentioned, when Victoria called about a separate matter, that Ava's father was the most consistent presence in his daughter's life, that he had never once missed a pickup, never once sent a substitute, never once allowed the routines that Ava depended on to be disrupted. Then the HR file, which contained James's original application and a section on prior work history she had never previously read. He had studied electrical and systems engineering. He had left, the file noted simply, for personal reasons. She requested his full application materials and found, at the back of the folder, a portfolio of technical work he had submitted for a systems role that had been rejected not on the basis of his qualifications, but because he had not completed his degree. She spent 40 minutes reviewing the portfolio and then called her director of operations. "Did we reject a systems engineer application from a James Carter 14 months ago?" she asked. There was a pause. There was a candidate who didn't have the degree requirement. "Look at the technical work he submitted." Another pause, longer this time. "I see it." She did not say anything further. She closed the portfolio and sat for a while. James had applied for an engineering role. He had been turned down because of a missing credential on paper. He had then applied for the only other opening available and taken it without complaint, because Ava's appointments were every other Thursday and the schedule was predictable and the insurance was adequate. He had not told anyone he was overqualified. He had not maneuvered for recognition. He had simply done what the work required, and then, when the work required more, he had done that too. She thought about what it must cost to be that careful all the time, to hold yourself that tightly, to trust the situation so little that silence felt safer than truth. She had built an organization on the principle that information was the most valuable resource available. She had never considered that some of her people might have very good reasons for believing that sharing information was not safe. It was not a comfortable thought. She let herself be uncomfortable with it, She called James the following morning and asked if they could meet. He said, yes. She met him in a conference room on the third-floor neutral ground, neither her office nor the lobby. She laid out what she wanted to say directly. She had a systems engineering position that had been unfilled for 8 months. The work was complex, the hours were standard, and the compensation was substantially higher than what a maintenance role paid. The company's health coverage for the position was comprehensive. She had reviewed his technical portfolio with 2 members of her engineering team, both of whom had asked, independently, where she had found the candidate. I'd like to offer you the role, she said. Formally, with appropriate documentation this time. James listened to all of this without reacting. Then he was quiet for a moment. I need to think about it, he said. She had not expected that. What concerns do you have? Ava, he said simply. My current schedule works around her appointments and her school hours. If the demands are different, I need to figure out whether it's possible before I say yes. He was not negotiating. He was genuinely unsure whether the better opportunity was actually better, measured against the one thing that mattered most to him. The schedule is flexible, she said. Within reason. If Ava's appointments need to be protected, they can be. He was quiet again, running calculations she could not see. I'll think about it, he said again. She had no choice but to accept this, which was another unfamiliar experience. Chloe was in the building that afternoon. A professional development day had emptied her school, and the nanny had a conflict, and Victoria had brought her in with an array of art supplies and clear expectations. When Victoria mentioned that she had spoken with James, Chloe looked up from her drawing with a directness that was, frankly, a little unsettling in a 6-year-old. Is he coming back? She asked. I offered him a different job, Victoria said. He's thinking about it. I could tell him it would be okay, Chloe said. I know how to help him decide. That is not necessary, Victoria said. But Chloe had already put down her pencil. She found James in the lobby, where he had come to return some materials to Frank Dolan. She walked up to him in her direct, furniture-moving way, and tugged the sleeve of his jacket until he crouched down. Whatever she said to him was too quiet for anyone else to make out. James listened with his full attention, the way he always listened. Something in his face shifted a small movement, barely visible, around his eyes. He stood up. He found Victoria at the elevator bank. I'll take the position, he said. Good, she said. She kept her voice level. It required some effort. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. James moved into his new role with the same quietness he brought to everything. He learned the systems, mapped the gaps, and began methodically to build what had not been built. His colleagues, initially uncertain how to categorize him, arrived at their conclusions gradually and without ceremony. The man knew what he was doing. That was sufficient. Ava's next appointment went smoothly. The cardiologist noted improvement in the metrics they monitored and adjusted her medication schedule in a way that reduced the frequency of her clinic visits. James received this news in the manner that parents receive good medical news, with a relief so deep it barely shows on the surface, moving instead through the body in a long, slow exhale. He called his sister that evening for the first time in several months. Chloe, for her part, was noticeably different in the weeks following James's return to the building. The particular guardedness that her teachers and her mother had grown accustomed to did not disappear entirely. That was not how these things worked, but it loosened. She laughed more easily. She talked about her day with a specificity she had not previously offered. She drew a picture one Friday afternoon of 4 people standing in front of a building and labeled them with careful, backward letters. Her name, her mother's name, a name clearly meant to be Ava, and a tall figure she called, with great seriousness, Mr. Yeah. Victoria found the drawing on her desk without explanation. She pinned it to the inside of her cabinet door, where only she would see it, and did not comment on it to anyone. The change in Victoria herself was subtler and harder to articulate. She had always been good at her work, and she remained good at it. She had always been decisive, and she remained decisive. But something had been introduced into the way she moved through her decisions, a slight additional pause, a moment's attention to what she might not know, a question she had started asking herself before acting. What does this person have reason not to tell me? And how would things look if I knew it? It was not a revolution. It was an adjustment. But adjustments, made consistently over time, reshape things. One afternoon in late October, on a day that had gone long and landed in that particular golden hour when light slants low through office windows and makes everything it touches look briefly like it means something, Victoria glanced out from her office doorway and saw James in the corridor below. He was crouched down to Ava's level. His daughter had been dropped off early, a scheduling complication, showing her something on a piece of paper. Chloe was there too, uninvited and unapologetic, leaning in to see what they were looking at. All three of them were laughing. Victoria stood in her doorway and did not move. She did not call out. She simply looked at the three of them, and something in her chest that she had held carefully in reserve for a very long time came quietly loose. She was still standing there when James glanced up and saw her watching. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them moved to fill the silence. They simply held each other's gaze across the distance of the corridor, and the quiet between them was not empty. It was, if anything, the most complete thing in the room.